Hey, what's up everybody? My name's Keena, and on this channel I talk about personal finance, investing, and business. So ESG funds have been exploding in popularity. ESG standing for environmental, social, and governance. Basically, these are sustainability funds that eliminate distasteful industries. And I'll give a bunch of examples of how that works in a second. So there's currently about $17 trillion invested using ESG or sustainability strategies. And I think that's up like 25-fold since the mid-90s. So along with this explosion in popularity in ESG funds has been a big rise in false advertising, misrepresentation, and greenwashing. Which is basically pretending something is climate friendly when it actually isn't. In fact, the problem has gotten so bad that SEC Chair Gary Gensler created a climate and ESG enforcement task force earlier this year with the goal of creating some universal standards so people know what the heck they're actually buying. I would describe this problem as one of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So basically, if you have the time and energy and inclination to dig way into the fine print in a fund's prospectus or their annual report, you're gonna know what's contained in it. You're gonna figure it out. But the problem is the advertising materials and what's on the website might make it sound like it's very different than it actually is. Today, we're gonna assess Blackrock, just because they're the most prominent institution when it comes to creating ESG funds, both in terms of the number of funds that they offer, but also the size or the assets under management inside of the fund. So let's get to it. Stick around. So here's the problem I ran into, and this might sound familiar if you've tried to buy an ESG fund before, but basically a few weeks ago, I decided to shift a chunk of my portfolio into ESG funds, and I got really confused. And that's because there are so many different options and categories. So there's your traditional funds that just address environmental, social, and governance issues. So, eliminating companies or industries that pollute or cause fossil fuel emissions, ones that mistreat their workers, have poor internal policies for dealing with conflicts of interest, that sort of thing. But then there's a lot of funds that get into the socially responsible investing space and eliminate things like adult entertainment or alcohol and tobacco, or companies that facilitate gambling or support the gambling industry, or weapons manufacturing. But then the subcategory is there. So are they eliminating just conventional military weapons, controversial military weapons, nuclear weapons, weapons for civilians or Second Amendment, some combination of those? You really got to read to figure it out. There's also funds that deal with gender equality. So they'll assign companies a score based on how fair they are to women and then eliminate low scoring companies. There are funds that eliminate funding for private prisons or any institutions that support private prisons. I could keep going, but those are just some examples off the top of my head. So the way to go about this that makes the most sense to me is to create a list of like the 15 areas or so, and then rank them 1 to 15. What do I care about most? What do I care about least? Or I know for a lot of these areas, maybe you don't care at all, but you kind of got to create a prioritization of what matters to you and what doesn't before you even go shopping for an ESG fund. Then the problem you run into is how do you find a fund that aligns with what you care about? And it's complicated even more by kind of this greenwashing, false advertising component. So I'm going to break this down and I'm going to give some really good tips and tricks for how to get to the bottom of this. So when it comes to BlackRock's ESG funds, there are two primary issues I have with the way that they operate. The first is that they use confusing terminology. So most of their funds eliminate thermal coal. Okay, for a layperson like you and I, what the heck does thermal coal mean? Is that cutting out all coal? Is that just one category of coal? Is thermal coal the worst way coal is used? You have to go out and do your own research because they just don't tell you anything. And so that's sort of a problem. The bigger issue that I've noticed, and I'm going to give a specific example so you can see how this works later on, is that they will buy a parent company that, say, is not doing anything environmentally destructive, right? But that parent company maybe owns a subsidiary. Either they 100% own it or they have a majority controlling stake in that subsidiary. And that subsidiary is doing very environmentally destructive things. Now, the fund can claim on a technicality, hey, look, we're not invested in that thing. But come on. Yes, you are. You're not fooling anybody. Or actually, yeah, I guess they are fooling people. But I call bull. Let's take a look at the Blackrock ESG website to just get an understanding of the funds that they offer. So right at the top, it says more ways to invest sustainably. And then we have these 6 categories. And the basic principle is going from left to right. As you get further to the right, the funds become more restrictive in terms of how stringent the ESG criteria are. So under the Seek to Reduce Controversy tab, we have ESG screened funds. Those are the least restrictive. Then under Strike a Balance, we have ESG Aware, which are kind of the middle ground. And then under Prioritize ESG, we have the ESG Advanced funds, which are the most strict. Then we have these 3 other categories on the side, these Focus on a Theme funds, which are basically environmental, low carbon type funds. See the Impact, that just has a bond fund, so I'm gonna ignore that. And then Think Climate is really just a duplication of the Focus on a Theme, so I'm gonna ignore that as well. It just has some of the funds from Focus on a Theme. Oh, and then one other thing, within each of these categories, you can find all types of funds, right? So United States, small, mid, and large cap, international, emerging, developed, pretty much any type of fund you'd want, they've got one within each of these categories. Let's switch over to an ESG scorecard I created. And basically this lists all of BlackRock's ESG funds and then ranks them in terms of what they contain and what they don't contain. By the way, if you find this valuable, it's available as a free PDF. There's no catch or anything like that. There's a link in the description. Just click there to download it. It might help you with choosing a fund. It helped me. So anyways, you can see across the top, I have the same categories as from the website, the ESG screened, ESG aware, ESG advanced, and then the thematic items. Then below that, we have ticker symbols. So the first one is XVV. This is their S&P 500 ESG fund. So it's basically S&P 500 companies minus ones that they deem to be unsustainable. Then we have XJH, which is a US mid-cap ETF that's been screened for ESG criteria, and so on. So I'm not going to go deep into what each of those funds are, but you get the general idea. So down the side, we have some categories, starting with civilian firearms, deforestation, fossil fuels, and so on. And the letter grades I've taken directly from As You Sow. This is a nonprofit 501c3 auditor that basically grades funds by what percentage of them are invested in certain areas. And this is really useful for BlackRock funds or for other funds as well, because they've got almost every one you could think of. You just go plug the ticker symbol in and it'll tell you what's in that fund and what isn't. So if you want to just get to the root of what a fund has and doesn't have, you could just skip the advertising materials from BlackRock or whatever institution and go directly to their website, plug the ticker in, and figure it out. I highly recommend it. So all of the information here is not developed by me. I just put it all in one place so we could compare the different ESG funds that BlackRock operates. A couple other things. At the bottom, we have some more info. So we've got the expense ratio. I gotta say, it's pretty reasonable. I'd say on average, ESG funds are about 4 times more expensive in terms of their fees. BlackRock's are not that much, maybe 2 times as expensive, something like that. I've got the assets under management so you can see the size of the funds. ESGU is the biggest. I think that's the biggest passive ESG fund in the world, like 21 or 22 billion in assets under management. I've got the segment, so US total market, US small, mid, and large, international, etc. And then I've got a tag for whether it's an active or a passively managed fund. Almost all of them are passive index funds, but there's 2 that are active, so I've got them listed out there. So now let's look at the letter grades. And something that I need to point out is that the letter grades don't necessarily relate to the claims that BlackRock has made for the funds. As an example, none of BlackRock's ESG funds claim to eliminate funds for private prisons. So when you see like a C or a D for a fund for a private prison on here, that doesn't mean that BlackRock's lying. It just means that there's a good percentage of the fund that's invested in the private prison industry. What these grades do relate to is what percentage of the fund is invested in these different areas. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, when we look at the Focus on a Theme funds, these are all green, clean energy funds, right? ICLN is the Global Clean Energy ETF. LTCU is a carbon transition, CRBN. Well, look at the ticker symbol. Carbon, low carbon, right? Here's the problem. Look at the grades they get for fossil fuel. It's not good. Why are funds that are claiming to be low carbon and low fossil fuel getting C's, D's, and F's from the third-party auditor in terms of fossil fuels. By the way, what these grades mean is a letter grade of a B is between 0 and 3% of the fund's assets are invested in either companies that are mining or extracting fossil fuels or burning them for energy, that kind of thing. A letter grade of a C means between 3 and 5.5% of the fund's assets are invested in companies, that are doing that with fossil fuels. And a D is between 5.5% to 9%. So ICLN gets a rating of an F, which means that over 9% of the fund's assets are involved in companies that are extracting or burning fossil fuels. Actually, 26% of the fund's holdings are involved with this, according to the auditor. Can you see how this is misleading? This is absurd to me. When I see a fund that's named low carbon or carbon transition, I'm going to assume 0%. It's just kind of ridiculous. Now I want to get into the weeds a little bit, and I want to fact check ESGU. This is the largest passive ESG fund in the world, and what I really want to show is how misrepresentation occurs. So again, the scorecard that I just showed doesn't consider the claims made by Blackrock for what is and isn't in the fund. What I want to do is look at each of those claims and look at what's really going on beneath the surface. So let me open the website and we can see the sustainable screening methodology, right? So it says, quote, as part of its investment objective, blah, 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 blah. Okay, business involvement screens, civilian firearms, controversial weapons, tobacco, thermal coal, and oil sands. If we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that they reiterate the claim with some added detail. 0% investment in controversial weapons, nuclear weapons. Okay, I almost didn't notice the one there. So 0.1% of the fund is invested in companies that support, the creation or proliferation of nuclear weapons. With over 21 billion in the fund, let's do some math real quick. Okay, that means that 21 million of this fund's assets should be in nuclear. Okay, we also have 0% investment in civilian firearms, tobacco, and UN Global Compact violators. Lastly, we have 0% investment in thermal coal and oil sands. Let's talk about this for a second. Blackrock is very specific about what types of coal and oil they're eliminating. So at first glance, you might think that it's divested from all coal and oil use, but this is definitely not the case. So thermal coal is when coal is burned to produce electricity, and it's one of two ways that coal can be processed. The other way is called coking, and that's when coal is used for steel production. Now, both of these ways to process coal are very environmentally damaging, and this fund is only claiming to avoid companies that use thermal coal for power generation. Let's talk about oil sands. This is an unconventional way to access oil. It's sort of like fracking, but instead of extracting difficult to reach oil from shale and other hard rock under the ground, the oil is extracted from these sand and tar pits. They're also under the ground, but most of them are, I think 70 or 75% of the world's oil sands are locked away in Canada. So getting the energy out is really intensive. It actually led to this protracted battle over the Keystone XL pipeline. I'm sure we've all seen that on the news over the last handful of years. But anyways, that pipeline was actually abandoned in the summer of 2021. So right off the bat, we need to be aware that this fund is really only claiming to eliminate very specific types of coal and oil use. And that means that this seemingly environmentally friendly ESG fund could be full of companies that are involved in conventional oil extraction, offshore drilling, fracking, mining coal for steel production, and so on and so on. And hold on, okay. Now look at the small print. It says, quote, Blackrock business involvement exposures, as shown above, for thermal coal and oil sands are calculated and reported for companies that generate more than 5% of revenue from thermal coal or oil sands. All right, I'm reading that really slowly because it's confusing. Basically, they're saying that if a company makes 5% or less of their money from thermal coal or oil sands, they're just going to look the other way and claim 0% for the purposes of containing it in the fund. Does that make sense? Took me a few read-throughs to wrap my brain around some of this. So here's what's absurd to me. If they're going to put down that 0.1% of the fund is invested in nuclear weapons, why not just be transparent and say what percent is invested in oil sands and in thermal coal? Well, why do they say 0%? Because if it's less than 5, we're going to round down. 5% could be a lot for some of these big companies. This makes no sense to me. Like, it's not necessarily dishonest, but it's misrepresenting what's going on. It's greenwashing. I'm just going to go that far. It's greenwashing. And I don't know about you, but I just feel like these companies should have to communicate upfront and be more transparent about all of this. Here's the other thing. It gets worse. So look at this. Quote, for the exposure to companies that generate any revenue from thermal coal or oil sands at a 0% revenue threshold, as defined by MSCI ESG research, so that's the company that the index kind of algorithm comes from, it is as follows. Thermal coal 0% and oil sands 1.24%. My spidey senses are they're just tingling. That asterisk of 5% being rounded down to 0 has another asterisk attached to it. Since when does fine print need another line of fine print to explain the first line of fine print? This doesn't make any sense. How can a company generate 0% revenue from thermal coal or oil sands for exposure to companies that generate? Oh, okay. I believe this is saying that 1.24% of the fund's underlying investments are involved in oil sands. I think that it's looping around, and that's what they're saying. Again, not sure why they just don't say that up front, but I guess being confusing, I don't know, maybe gets more people to buy your fund. I don't know. It's not very transparent. Okay, time to fact check, and let's start by looking at the weapons claims. So starting with the military ones, let's flip over to weaponfreefunds.org. Again, this is an As You Sow website. We can see that there's a letter grade of D. And on the matrix that I showed earlier, I think this means 2 to 3% of the fund is invested in like military weapons. Okay, so looking at controversial weapons, fact check true.
Fact check true.
No involvement. Looking at nuclear, so they claimed 0.1%. I got the math here, which would mean 21 million in assets of the funds would be invested in nuclear weapons. The auditor says 308 million, or 1.39% of the portfolio, is invested in nuclear weapons. And we can see 6 companies in the fund that are involved in this activity. Now, I'm not an expert in the military at all or anything like that, but a quick Google search that I did earlier confirms that the top 2 companies listed here, Honeywell and Raytheon, are definitely involved in nuclear weapons projects. I also double-checked that these companies were indeed held in the fund. I don't want to completely rely on the auditor, and they are. But the amounts that are held are slightly different. I think what this is I'm looking at a semi-annual report from like 7 months ago, and I think the As You Sow data is like day by day updated because when I reload the page, the numbers shift a little bit. So I think it's just that I have outdated information. But look, at the end of the day, I don't think it's worth it to confirm 100%. So I'm just going to score this as potentially untrue, but I think they're being honest here. The next claim is civilian firearms, and the fund claims 0% exposure. And when we plug this into gunfreefunds.org, we can see that this is also fact check true. No firearm manufacturers or resellers are contained in the fund. Let's look at tobaccofreefunds.org, and it appears that this claim holds up as well. No tobacco companies or tobacco promoting entertainment industries are in the fund.
Fact check true. Fact check true.
Lastly, let's check coal and oil exposure. We can see it says 5.21% of the fund's assets are invested in fossil fuel companies. So that's kind of on the cusp of a C or D ranking in the way that they do it. In terms of coal producers, this claim checks out. Let's see. Under users of coal, we've got 10 holdings. I'm inclined to believe BlackRock's claim because in the small print, they say that if the company generates less than 5% of revenue from burning coal, it counts as coal-free. Just looking at the names of these companies and quick Google searching, I'm inclined to believe this one as well. These companies do appear to be sustainable, right? So I'm going to mark this down as true but misleading because of this whole 5% down to 0% asterisk on an asterisk thing. Lastly, the oil sands claim. And this is where it gets interesting, and this is kind of where I'm going to show the loophole. So clicking on oil and gas industry, we can see that 2.33% of the fund is invested in these companies, with ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips as the largest three holdings. Now, all three of these companies have active operations in Canada, where about 70% of the world's oil sands are located. Again, I did some Googling because I didn't know this, but extracting oil from loose sands is difficult and more damaging to the environment than conventional extraction, just in the same way that fracking is. So I do understand why this fund is trying to eliminate those types of companies, but it also seems like a convenient elimination because, like, for example, they're not eliminating fracking from their fund, but they are eliminating oil sands, and they're doing it right when the Keystone XL pipeline was shut down. So it's like less economically feasible to mine oil sands because how are you going to sell it? It just seems like they're eliminating out of convenience more than anything else. But hey, that's not a crime. That's just my opinion. So up front, I think that BlackRock is technically right that none of these companies are directly mining oil sands. Instead, all three of these companies control subsidiary companies, which do the extraction. And that's the kind of loophole thing that I pointed to at the beginning of the video. It adheres to the letter of the law, but in my opinion, definitely not the spirit of the law. And Exxon is the worst offender. So they are heavily invested in oil sands mining in Canada through two of their subsidiaries. The first is Imperial Oil Limited, a company that ExxonMobil has a 69.6% ownership stake in, which gives them majority control, and it basically means that's an extension of them. The other company that's actively mining is ExxonMobil Canada Properties. Now, this is a Canadian corporation that's wholly owned by ExxonMobil, but it is technically a separate Canadian firm, so it's not Exxon itself. So let's look at Exxon's 2020 annual filing, which discusses two oil sands projects, Syncrude and Kearl. I think I'm saying that right. Exxon's share of net production at Syncrude in 2020 was 68,000 barrels per day and 219,000 barrels at Kearl. Let's write these numbers down. 68. Yeah, I already had them written down for the video, but whatever. Some quick math tells me that this adds up to 287,000 barrels per day from Exxon's oil sands projects, or the projects that their subsidiaries are doing. What's the same difference? Okay. Earlier in their annual report, they state that the entire company produces about 4 million barrels today. So this is just some simple math. Is it above or below the 5% that is claimed by BlackRock? So if we divide 287,000 by 4 million, we get 13% of the oil extracted by Exxon in 2020 was from oil sands. That's above a 5% threshold. It's just technically, I also found a couple articles stating that they have ramped up oil sands production in 2021, well above 2020 levels. So that 13% number is probably even higher today. Regardless, 13% exceeds the 5% or less figure claimed by BlackRock, and they only get away with holding Exxon because of their technicality. So I'm going to mark this down as very misleading. I'm not going to say false because, again, technically Exxon isn't doing the mining, but since their majority-owned subsidiaries are, that violates the spirit of their claim. And I think loopholes in issues like this are why Gary Gensler and the SEC are trying to crack down. Okay, that's it, folks. If you found this video useful, if you're using my PDF, which you definitely should in the video description, I hope that helps. And again, if any of this is useful, smash that subscribe button. It really helps me to grow. Thank you, and I'll see you all in the next one.